We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago. We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
Hi, everyone. Hoping that you all are doing well. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be having a discussion, a brief discussion, on the topic of the Constitution and American Indians and what is known as federal recognition. We're not going to do a deep dive into this topic. We're going to again do this rather cursory discussion because this is such a deep topic and a very broad topic. And so we're just going to touch on a couple of dynamics related to this situation. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the dynamic of caste systems. Many individuals in the United States believe that we have a system that is not a caste system. And many also believe that we have these biological classifications related to race with these categories of black and white. However, what we actually have is simply a caste system with black signifying a particular caste level and white signifying a particular class level. These distinctions are not really about phenotype. They are not really about ancestry. They are really about these categories that have been chosen and people have been placed into for various reasons. What has been confusing, of course, is that people have been taught that these black and white racial classifications are really related to ancestry and really related to phenotype. However, when you look at the individuals who are classifying themselves as black and white, you will notice that those individuals are neither black nor white. So we're just going to look at this construct of caste system, and then we're going to look at the relevance of this for the United States Constitution and for American Indians, and of course, those who are identifying themselves as or being identified as black or white. So, what is a caste system really all about? A caste system, according to this dictionary definition, is about an inheritance. It's about an inheritance into a particular class of people, a social class in society. But what's also noteworthy is that this word or this construct, caste, is actually coming from this idea of chastity. Yes, being chaste. And so it's about this idea of purity or pollution in relation to social status. And so, in other words, those who would be considered of a higher social status, those individuals would be identified as more pure, clean. And those who are of the lower classes would be considered not as pure and not as clean. With that alone, you know that humanity has a number of problems, okay? All right, and so this idea of a caste system is about dividing individuals into these various categories and figuring out who's going to inherit privileges and who's going to inherit oppression and who's going to fit into these socially distinct groupings. And of course, you know this came from colonization. And so, with respect to this idea of caste or chaste, we have this, generally speaking, coming from the 16th century, related to race and breeding, coming from the Spanish and the Portuguese, who, by the way, in the colonies have so many classifications in which people might be placed or they might fall into based upon lineage. But there is this dynamic of looking for or trying to create or define racial purity. Here you have another sociological definition related to, again, this idea of a hereditary social group and these limitations that are placed on people based upon rank, occupation, and economic position. In other words, socioeconomic status, SES. So before we go off into the discussion about the caste systems and the United States Constitution, we're just going to quickly look at some of this etymology information. And so it indicates here that caste, understood as a noun, from 1610s, was understood as one of the hereditary social groups of India. Now, of course, India is known for having these rigid caste systems. It's also noteworthy that the Portuguese pretty much invaded India, okay, and there were Aryan invasions of India that helped to proliferate this whole idea of these caste systems and these categories and these ranks in society, and also classifying people based upon being pure or butter or being of a mixed collective of people. And individuals in India were and are cut off from certain privileges based upon these rankings, or they are admitted to certain privileges based upon these rankings. And where else do you find this bizarre dynamic going on? You find this also in South Africa. However, I want to point out that based upon narcissism and people being egocentric, ethnocentric, narcissistic. You have these dynamics of caste all over the place. This is why you have concerts, for instance, that have VIP sections. Many people want to be in the VIP section. Many people want to be of the higher rank. Many people want privileges and access to things that they believe other people can't have. And so their self-esteem, their self-worth is tied to them being able to have access that other people cannot have. And so, in a way, they feel good about themselves when other people feel bad about themselves. They feel good about themselves when they are treated in a special way and other people are denigrated. Again, bizarre stuff in terms of humanity. And so again, this is also related to the 1500s with this whole idea of being chaste or racially pure. Of course, you see this with respect to the American Indians related to what classification? And here is additional information about what took place in India with the Aryan invaders and the conquerors of India. And with respect to these castes that were or are in India, the lower collective, the subjugated original people of India, are considered the lower caste. And that's pretty much the way it's done around the world with these invaders, these colonizers. The original people, the indigenous people of the land, somehow always end up being on the bottom caste. Now, this is interesting because the individuals with the actual birthright to the land, primogeniture, those individuals are the ones who have been placed on the bottom. Those are the individuals. However, in terms of the law, those individuals are actually the ones that are on top. However, through gaslighting, people have been induced to believe just the opposite. And so, again, with respect to this race idea, this caste system idea, complexion or skin color has come into play. And so the way that things have been structured around the world, even when you have an entire collective of darker people, individuals find a way to figure out who is the lightest among the darkest in order to, again, create these weird caste systems. And so, with respect to India, that dynamic has been going on for quite a while. You see some manifestations of it, and there's a movie called Monsoon Wedding, and you can see some manifestations of it in that particular film. But this is a dynamic that has been going on for a while. And interestingly, you see the same things going on in South Africa. You see the same things going on in Australia. You see the same things going on in the Americas that you see going on in India. And so there is a common thread that's running through all of these collectives. And here you see the adjective of chaste. And you see this is coming from the 1200s, meaning virtuous and pure. And so, this idea of purity, racial purity, was also tied to moral purity. Now, if you think about it, when you look at the definitions of constructs such as black and white, you see these moral determinations related to the construct of black and the construct of white that facilitate this odd, again, human dynamic of categorizing people based upon this idea of purity, whether we're talking about moral purity or whether we're talking about bloodline purity.
We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
So essentially, what is being addressed with respect to these caste systems is the dynamic of status or status. This means someone's standing in the world, in society, in a collective, someone's rank, someone's position. And so, with respect to that whole blood quantum purity dynamic, that is related to this idea of determining status. Because the idea is that those who are closest to what would be considered full blood Indians, technically they have the highest rank, the highest status, the highest position, the highest standing. Now, we can blame some of this on teachers and parents for not teaching their children their actual colors because you have many individuals who mistake white and black in terms of color for various shades of brown. And so you have a number of people who are walking around using these constructs of black and white as if there are real people that are in these categories of black and white based upon their skin color being black and white. Okay, so this is a delusion that we really should address collectively. Children should not be confused like this. Children should know that these are caste systems. For that matter, adults should know that these are actual caste systems. People run around talking about having pride in being black and pride in being white. These are caste systems. Okay, all right, and so there are three entities in the United States in terms of these caste systems. We have black, we have white, and we have indigenous. In other words, American Indian, Indio. Now, when individuals enter the United States, they enter in one of these categories. Now, of course, they are not going to enter as indigenous. However, they will enter as either black or white. And this is not completely related to skin color or phenotype. This is a caste system, a class system about who's going to get privileges and who is not going to get privileges. This is why you can have people from Africa, North Africa, and South Africa, and even West Africa and East Africa come to the United States and be classified as white when, in terms of phenotype, they may be even darker than many of the people who are classified as African American or American Indian. And so it's a very odd dynamic. And then you can have many individuals that enter the United States, and for some circumstances, they might have been considered one thing in their homeland, but when they arrive here, they are suddenly not whatever they were before, but now they are suddenly black. Okay? And so there are various ways that you enter into these various caste systems that we have going on, but these are the primary caste systems. In other words, you're either black or you're white or you are Amerindian. So those are the three primary categories there. And so we're not going to be focusing on ethnicities and the Constitution. We're going to be looking at this dynamic of these caste systems in the United States Constitution. And the caste systems, again, primarily black and white. And what you will note in many of these places where they have this interesting dichotomy going on in terms of these caste systems, they will have another category of people called half caste or colored. One thing that many might not recognize is that being identified as black or white in the United States signals that the individual is an outsider. Black and white signify outsider. Black and white signify foreign. And also what's noteworthy is that these two caste categories, black and white, are not recognized by the United States Constitution.
We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago.
It often helps to look at the Abrahamic narrative related to dynamics that we are discussing, and this is another one of those dynamics. And so for those of you who have more recent ancestry, I want to say more recent, I mean the last 300-400 years in this particular space, this would apply to you and your ancestors, okay? And so with respect to scripture, the idea of black and white, those caste systems, they are tied to this category known as a stranger, a foreigner, an alien. And remember, that is a part of Abraham's identity. So this is a big thing in scripture because basically Abraham and Abraham's descendants are these entities that travel around quite a bit. And so they tend to be strangers in foreign lands quite a bit. They tend to be aliens in various spaces. And so it's always very interesting when individuals identify as one of the Abrahamic collectives, and then they have an oppositional position with respect to other foreigners, aliens, and strangers. Because the fact is that they all are when they are not in their land. However, some individuals seem to see themselves at that higher caste of alien, stranger, or foreigner, sometimes in such a way that they try to position themselves as the indigenous of the land with all of the rights that go along with that. However, if individuals' grandparents came from somewhere else, then they would be considered this, what you see in Strong 1616 Gar, okay? And so again, you see here this Gar related to this idea of a person being a guest. Again, you see aliens, foreigners, immigrants, sojourners, strangers, aliens in a foreign land, all of that. You also see this construct related to proselytizing. Again, this category is related to a person being a temporary dweller, a newcomer. And with respect to scripture, it means that these entities have no inherited rights as opposed to one who is homeborn. In other words, indigenous to the land. In other words, an entity that sprouted up from the land, not someone who came from entities that transitioned into the land. And so these individuals would be entitled to, according to scripture, significant hospitality. They would be considered guests and treated accordingly. And so, with respect to Jacob's collective, for instance, those who would be dwelling in the lands that Jacob would be claiming, those individuals would be treated as guests. They wouldn't have inherited rights. However, they would be treated with significant hospitality, or at least, according to scripture, they are supposed to be treated with significant hospitality. Part of this is coming from the idea in scripture that Abraham has been an alien in foreign lands and has been a guest who has been treated well, quite frankly. Also, Jacob has been an alien in foreign lands and has been treated well in many instances in those foreign lands. However, with respect to this paradigm, individuals have inherited rights based upon their ancestors. And so someone who is traveling into a foreign land, they would not have inherited rights to the land. In other words, they don't have birthright. Now you hear all of this talk about birthright citizenship and the Constitution. However, that dynamic is pretty much inconsistent with what is indicated in scripture. And so individuals could become guests and could apparently stay for forever as guests wherever they might be around the world. However, they don't have the same rights as the entities that rose up from these various places. Again, it is this idea of dwelling temporarily and not being native to a particular place, not having ancestors that are native to a particular place. And so, with respect to this idea of the Ger, these would be individuals who, again, would be treated with significant hospitality. Additionally, the idea of being a settler and a colonizer go against this entire construct of Ger. This is important, of course, because the foundation of the charters, the foundation of the papal bulls, the foundation was based upon this settler, colonizer, conquering dynamic, conquering and colonizing the very entities that served as the host, the entities that served as the welcoming committee, the entities that served to help the visitors to survive and to thrive, the entities that provided not only hospitality but justice for the visiting entities. And so this is supposed to be rooted in the history of Jacob's descendants. And so Jacob's descendants are supposed to be very keen on making sure that they are kind to foreigners based upon how they were treated when they were traveling through, settling in, hanging out in a place identified as Egypt. Again, it indicates that this Ger construct was used throughout the Hebrew Bible to describe individuals who are not native to the land in which they reside. These are individuals and collectives who receive hospitality and protection from the host community. However, they are not native to the land. Continuing on, there is this focus on justice, compassion, and inclusion. And so, of course, this is all very interesting because you hear all of these individuals who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ. However, the first thing that they want to do is exclude people, exhibit a lack of empathy, and act in ways that would be considered unjust. There is supposed to be an admonition to not exploit or oppress foreign residents. This is for Jacob specifically because, again, it goes back to that whole idea of Jacob and Abraham being foreigners in various lands, specifically Egypt. And so there's supposed to be this theme of empathy and ethical treatment. And so there's supposed to be very special care taken for the visitors. And so, in other words, you don't have children who are visiting. You don't have teenagers who are visiting to study and mistreat them. And so that's supposed to be an admonition that's supposed to be played out with respect to those who claim to follow Jesus Christ or claim to follow the Torah. And so there's also this mention in Leviticus. And remember, most of our laws are coming from Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Okay, and when I say our laws, I mean the laws in America, in the United States. And so there's this idea that you're supposed to treat a foreigner living among you as a native born and love them as brothers as you would love yourself. Okay, and so you're supposed to take care of their children the same way you take care of your children. However, of course, we have a situation in the United States where we don't collectively take good care of the children. And so therefore, individuals coming from outside of the United States should not expect extraordinary care of children that come from outside of the United States, because there is not extraordinary care for the children that are right within the United States. Okay.
We are the land. This is dedicated to our relatives before us, thousands of years ago, more than 150.
You're probably wondering, when are we going to get to the Constitution? We're getting there. Okay, so with respect to these two categories, this black caste category and this white caste category, as hard as it might be to believe, both of these entities are considered caste contaminants. And so these entities, if they are mixed with the American Indians, they serve as contaminants of what would be considered the purity of American Indians. And so you see that blood quantum related to this. Now, people get confused because it seems like those who have more of the white contaminant, that they are treated better than those who have what's considered the black contaminant. However, both of these categories are considered contaminants because the purity is within the American Indian. And so the primogenitor, the head, the top caste, the top group is really the American Indian. And so all of these other entities serve as a contamination of sorts. And so that's where this whole blood quantum thing is coming from. However, blood quantum, again, is inconsistent with general rules of inheritance, general rules of family law, probate law. It's inconsistent with all of that. And so there's no dynamic of contamination that precludes you from inheriting from your ancestors. However, that's the way that this has been positioned. And so this categorizing has been used to actually have people disinherited or distanced from their American Indian status. But there's nothing that can distance you from it. If that's what you are, that's what you are. If you had any grandparents who were, that's what you are. And that's what you will always be. You and all of your descendants. You are whoever your ancestors were. However, this category of black and white, these foreign categories, these have nothing to do with the American Indian status. They don't give anything to it or really take anything away from it in terms of natural law. Now, with respect to these laws and these policies and these odd things we have in place related to these caste systems, of course, there are implications. But in terms of reality, it doesn't matter. Because again, your ancestors are who they are, and their descendants are who they are. The only thing that this black and white contaminant dynamic does is to distract individuals, either the American Indian individuals or other individuals who are onlookers. It distracts them from the reality of the status of the American Indian. Now, for the Constitution. Okay. First of all, black and white are not recognized in the Constitution. So this is a part of our responsive discussion here. Black and white are not mentioned in the Constitution. These are not constructs. I know it sounds strange, but these are not constructs that are respected within the Constitution. You will see the construct of race in the Constitution, but these caste systems of black and white and all of the variations, colored and all of that, they are not recognized as legal entities. They are not real. They are legal fictions. The only entity that is real in terms of social strata, the only entity is the American Indian. And so you see the American Indian mentioned in the United States Constitution. And so that's the only entity, quite frankly, that matters in terms of the Constitution. It's the only entity in terms of these caste systems. It's the only entity that has any form of recognition. And part of that, of course, is that the American Indian is the original entity. The American Indian is the only entity in terms of these caste system entities. It's the only entity that actually has a birth right with respect to the land. Now, this is an interesting time to exist because of the way that politics is playing out with respect to the law now. Okay, and so you can see this and how it relates to the American Indian situation. So we have these laws on the books, including the Constitution, of course. And so these are the laws. However, what you also see are individuals and collectives ignoring the law. And so there is the reality of the law and then the law in practice. And you have a number of people who've just decided that they are not going to respect the law. The law is what it is. The law is the reality. However, there are individuals, again, and collectives of individuals that have just decided that they're going to pretend that the law doesn't exist or that the law simply doesn't apply to them. And so that's what you have with the American Indian situation and the birthright dynamic. The birthright is with the American Indians. And you see these efforts to pretend to recognize that in the form of these trust dynamics. Okay, and so these trust situations are supposed to be set up to protect the land for forever and to protect the rights of the American Indians for forever, to respect their first position as the firstborns, as the only borns, quite frankly. And so all of that is set up that way. But of course, it's not real in terms of practice. And so that's what you see with the rest of the laws right now. We have these laws on the books. Um, Many of them are not being enforced in terms of respecting these Supreme Court rulings, these court rulings, statutes. So there's a disrespect for those things. At the same time, insisting that those things are important and that everyone else needs to follow these things. And so it's the same dynamic we have going on with the American Indian situation. The law is the law is the law. But it doesn't mean that people are going to follow the law. And we are now finding out that, of course, we believe that if these laws existed, either people would follow the laws or someone would enforce the laws to sort of induce people to follow the laws. But now we see that it might not always work out as neatly and cleanly as people have anticipated. And so that's what we see with respect to the recognition of American Indians. With recognition of American Indians, the only thing that really means is recognizing the American Indians as independent entities, as separate entities. And American Indians are separate entities. We don't even have, again, valid treaties. We don't have American Indians, in particular, with respect to the collectives that were removed. We don't have these women who owned the land, by the way, in many instances. We don't have them participating in the negotiations. We don't have them writing up any treaties in their language. We don't have them signing anything. We have some very odd dynamics going on with these treaties. And so therefore we don't even have real treaties. But it doesn't matter, because many of the entities that you see now not following the rules, these are the same entities that would disrespect and that do disrespect these treaties. And so whether you have the treaties or you don't have the treaties, those who are entitled to first position with respect to the land, according to Abrahamic tradition, according to the Old Testament, according to the New Testament, it is the American Indians. And so all of these entities that are talking about they are following Jesus and following Christ, however, they have no problem with holding on to land that does not belong to them, or cheating people out of their land, or just completely disrespecting the fact that the people who are the original people are still in existence. All of that lets you know that they don't really believe what it is they claim to believe. You see this dynamic going on all over the world. This is not just something that's going on in the Americas, and that needs to be made clear, because sometimes individuals get sort of ego-centered and think that what's happening to them is just happening to them. This dynamic has been going on all over the world. You see it most manifested, of course, in the Americas. And then you see it manifested in Africa, not just South Africa, however. You see this in West Africa. It's just that you don't see the color variations, and so therefore you don't necessarily recognize that the same thing is going on. You see it in all of the Caribbean islands. Yes, the same thing is going on. You have the indigenous people in the Caribbean pushed aside so that the settlers can possess the land. You see the same thing in Australia. You see the same thing in New Zealand. You see the same thing in parts of Europe. And so with respect to these entities that are claiming this Christ right to these lands and this Christ right to displace people are acting inconsistent with the Bible that they claim to uphold. And finally, one additional way to think about American Indians with respect to these various places around the world. So we're not just talking about American Indians, but just indigenous people around the world that have these systems superimposed onto them, along with an appropriation of their identity and their resources. What you basically have, consistent with a biblical offering, is the indigenous people are in the structures, but they are not of the structures. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.
We are the land. This is dedicated to our elders before us, thousands of years ago, more than 100. We are the land. This is dedicated to our elders before us, thousands of years ago, more than 100. We are the land. This is dedicated to our elders before us, thousands of years ago, more than 100. We are the land.